Happy Easter. Today is Easter, if you didn't know that already. Of course, in the Christian tradition, this is the day when a man named Yeshua, Jesus, was executed, he was dead, buried, was resurrected, arose from the dead, appeared to his followers, speaking to them, eating fish with them, and overall showing up as if he hadn't been murdered just a few days before. And for those of you who have attended worship service on Easter here with me before, you will know that I have a lot of trouble with this story. It frustrates me. It confounds me. It confronts me. I don't get it. And it kind of drives me nuts that I don't get it. Because it feels like it's one of those inside jokes that everyone else in the room seems to be laughing at, and the fact that I don't get it makes it even funnier. For those who identify as Christian, Easter is the central story of their faith, the grounding proof that Jesus was God incarnate and therefore worthy of our worship and praise. But my friends, in a post-Enlightenment, post-Galileo, post-Newton, post-Darwin, post-Einstein world, the idea that a person whose heart hasn't been beating for 3 days would suddenly rise up alive and functioning as he always had been is pretty tough for me to reconcile. And I think tough even for most of the Christians of today, even for those who are deeply moved by the story every year, but remain unchanged by it. So it'd be easy for me to grumpily toss this whole story aside, to chalk it up to supernatural, superstitious nonsense. That'd be easy. Except I don't think we should. I don't think I can. I believe this story demands our attention. It demands that we wrestle with it. It demands that we find meaning in it. It demands that we look beyond the words to the emotion, to the intuition, to the imagination, to the memory, to the faith of this story. I read this piece of writing. It was part of a letter by Andrew Linscott. He writes this. He says, "You were born into a culture that hemorrhages loneliness but fears community. A culture that craves meaning but is allergic to depth. We fear these things because of the attention and discomfort and commitment and patience that they require of us. And we are inundated with bright screens that demand none of these things but promise bright flashes of human connection and sharp jolts of laughter and entertainment, and they leave us restless and searching and numb." I read once also an article that commented that Easter was one of those holidays where Christian churches are packed. People who never cross the threshold of a sanctuary, save for maybe Christmas Eve, show up. Perhaps it's out of obligation, family tradition, but then they leave with nothing more than what they arrived with, restless and searching and numb. And I don't think that they leave that way because they don't appreciate the story. It's a good story. The story of a man born to humble means who possesses an inherent gift of love and compassion for all of life. A man born to humble means who possesses this inherent gift of love and compassion for all of life. A man who notices that the people he loves are being held down by religious traditions that have become a force of control, traditions that have lost their grounding in love and relationship and replaced it with legalistic moralities of sin and punishment. A man who notices, too, that the people he loves are being subjugated, enslaved by an economic and political empire that is built on the idea that a superior force means a superior, privileged people who can oppress, who can ignore, silence, arrest, enslave, and execute those whose lives that they believe do not matter. But those lives mattered to Yeshua, to Jesus. And so he goes around telling the truth about love, telling the truth about what it is to be a human being in this world and in this life. He goes around waking people up to the love that lies within them, and some people do begin to awaken. And this makes the established order nervous. Because awakened people, my friends, awakened people are a threat to oppression and control. People awakened to love are not going to stand by and watch their neighbors starve. They're not going to stand by and watch their friends live in fear. Awakened people tend not to shrug their shoulders and go about their business when children are murdered in their schools, or when a policeman kneels on a man's neck, murdering him in full view of the public. Awakened people know that their lives do matter and go out and amplify the voices of the lives that don't seem to matter much to the status quo, to the economic, political, and social powers that exist. So he's out there waking people up. And here's the thing. At this point in the story, if it were me, if I were Jesus, because I'm a little conflict averse, which means I'm not always as courageous as I'd like to be. If it were me, I probably would have stayed in the countryside, happily preaching my message of love and inclusion and taking care of each other. It would have been fine. But for whatever reason, Jesus doesn't follow my advice. Instead, he heads right into the center of all that power in his homeland. The center of the religious authorities, the center of the economic and political authorities, the ones he's been irritating. And he shows up at their doorstep. He demonstrates in their temple, upending their profiteering tables, the ones that enrich a few at the expense of the people that they should be serving. We know the rest of the story. It's predictable to anyone who has observed how systems of power respond against voices that tell the truth. Systems of power leverage their power to silence truth tellers, to blame the truth tellers for their own oppression. To blame the truth tellers for their own oppression. They should work harder. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And if you don't happen to have boots, well, it's probably your own fault. Jeez. Were you injured in some way? What were you wearing? You should just comply with our orders. So in Jerusalem, friends, it was no different. It was no different. Jesus is arrested on bogus charges. He is then murdered in public, in full view, because this is what we do to those who threaten our economic security, our sense of moral and social superiority, even our comfort. This is what happens to those who dare point out the truth that our society, our culture, our institutions are not built on love, but on a lie that enriches and privileges one person at the expense and oppression of another. The Christian scholar John Dominic Crossan writes that violence is society's drug of choice. It deludes us. It creates this contorted belief that peace comes forth from violence, that through violence we keep control, and that through control, nonviolence will emerge. Do you see how twisted that logic is? But it's a logic that seems to have ruled our societies for millennia. That execution, the murder that is supposed to be the end of it, power restored to the already privileged. All that love talk is supposed to be silenced when we crucify the speaker. But in this story, something else happens. And this is where things get a little weird. A little hard to believe, but as in all stories, it depends on how we tell it. Tradition tells us that Jesus was resurrected. He was dead, and then he wasn't anymore. The tomb was empty. And the Western Church talks about Jesus' resurrection as an individual event. He rose. He rose. Which is why, perhaps, so many of us have trouble with this story. Where are we in all of that? What difference, friends, truly, what difference does it make to me that a couple thousand years ago, this guy allegedly came back to life, and that somehow defeated death? What difference does that make to me? I don't know what to make of that. None of the people I love who have loved me and have died are coming back. Again, John Dominic Crossan notes that something is distinctly different in the way the Eastern Christian church thinks of resurrection than the Western Christian church. You may be familiar in Eastern Orthodox, is another phrase that we use for that. Relies a lot on iconography, these beautiful icons and images as part of their worship. So in the iconography, the form of art most commonly found in these Orthodox Eastern Christian churches, they don't use the word resurrection. They use the word Anastasis. In those images, we see Jesus stepping on or over a bound skeletal figure representing death, with the ruins of the gates of hell, of Hades, behind him. Jesus is rising. But he is not alone. The icons show him grasping the hands of two figures, a man and a woman, Adam and Eve, humanity. The iconography of all of humanity, resurrection, my friends, is not about an individual. It's about all of us. It's about all humanity. It's about all of us being lifted from the slumber of death, of being lifted out from oppression, from privilege, from the toxic ideas that one person is greater than another, that one race is superior, that one kind of person, particularly the compliant and complicit, is more valued than any other. Resurrection is being awakened to life, of being awakened again and again and again to love, the motive force that connects us one to another. Resurrection is not the miraculous act of an individual, but is, in Crossan's words, corporate. It is communal. It is universal. Universal. Like the call of our universalist heritage that says that all of our salvation in this life, on this earth, in this time, is for everyone. We are all saved from our slumber, from our disconnection, from our loneliness, from our isolations, from our fear, from our violence. Universalism is about a communal resurrection. We all come alive, or none of us do. Resurrection is about learning to feed one another with those long-handled spoons, instead of suffering and dying trying to feed ourselves. Feeding one another with those long-handled spoons, instead of suffering and dying trying to feed ourselves. I've been using this word, resurrection. It's how the term Anastasis is usually translated, and it's a pretty good cognate. It's a good translation. But if we were to directly translate Anastasis, it would be ana, up, and stasis, rising. Anastasis is uprising. So let this Easter be our uprising. Let this Easter be 1,000 Tennessee students marching on their state legislature, the center of their political power, demanding a change to the gun culture that poses a clear and imminent threat to their lives. Let this uprising, this Easter, be those few legislators who dared to rise with those students to demand accountability and were punished for it. Let this Easter be our saying, enough. Enough to the violence that permeates our culture and infects our hearts. Let this Easter be our awakening to the truth that we are not born simply to die. We are not born simply to die, but to make manifest the love that gives this life meaning and purpose. Let this Easter, this uprising, be our threat against the status quo, against the political and economic powers that diminish life, that subjugate life, that try to convince us that we are in competition for a finite amount. Let this Easter be our uprising, and let this uprising be our blessing. And so I invite you to hear the words of blessing from Jan Richardson. Here's the one thing you must understand about this blessing. It's not for you alone. It is stubborn about this. Don't even try to lay hold of it if you are by yourself, thinking you can carry it on your own. To bear this blessing, you must first take yourself to a place where everyone does not look like you or think like you, a place where they do not believe precisely as you believe, where their thoughts and ideas and gestures are not exact echoes of your own. Bring your sorrow. Bring your grief. Bring your fear. Bring your weariness, your pain, your disgust at how broken the world is, how fractured, how fragmented by its fighting, its wars, its hungers, its penchant for power, its ceaseless repetition of the history it refuses to rise above. I will not tell you that this blessing will fix all that. But in the place where you have gathered, wait and watch and listen. Lay aside your inability to be surprised, your resistance to what you do not understand. See then whether this blessing turns to flame on your tongue, sets you to speaking what you cannot fathom, or opens your ear or to a language beyond your imagining that comes as a knowing in your bones, a clarity in your heart that tells you this is the reason we were made, for this ache that finally opens us, for this struggle, this grace that scorches us toward one another and into the blazing day. Amen, my friends. And I love you.